This episode was sponsored by our patrons: Caitlin McTaggart, Michaela Frew, Chantel Oliver, Jill Harrigan, Valerie Jacobson, Jamie Lang, Amanda Gilmore, Maria Sanchez, Heather McKinnon, Jan Elise Cannon, Cornelia Weiss, Bree Alto, Robin Brown, Bree Ames Smith, Siobhan Keenan, and Kim Hokinson. You can become a sponsor for as little as $1 a month to help us make more episodes and get these episodes ad-free. Thank you so much for being our sponsors. We couldn't do it without you. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, Katie.
It's 40 BC. It's been 4 years since Julius Caesar was murdered by the ancient Roman Senate. Octavian, his adopted heir, is wreaking havoc across Rome. He's seized the properties of many ancient families and given their villas and their farms to his own soldiers.
Sure.
Central Italy is in chaos, and these displaced families, plus refugees from his wars, they're all pouring into the streets of Rome, and he doesn't seem to care. Inevitably, a group of people take a stand, and it's come to this moment. They're making their last stand behind the walls of the hilltop town of Perugia. Octavian has them surrounded and besieged. He doesn't care how many people die. His soldiers are hurling these lead bullets over the walls of Perugia using slingshots. And amazingly, many of those bullets, or sling stones, survive. Why do we care about this? Because Octavian's soldiers sometimes inscribed messages onto the bullets before launching them. They're like psychological warfare. I mean, some things never change.
Yep.
Threatening the people inside the walls of Perugia. And they're saying things like, take this, you are starving, strike Rome, and things like that. Two of them, though, are particularly interesting. Here's what they say. Fulvia, culum pandite. Fulvia, spread them cheeks. And petto landicam fulviae, which translates as, I'm aiming for Fulvia's clit. Fulvia, is this bullet calling out a woman in a battle? This is ancient Rome, when women's place is firmly in the home. But, yes indeed, Fulvia, a woman, was leading this faction. She stood with a sword girded to her side and addressed the soldiers with rousing speeches as they made their righteous stand in the face of the despot Octavian. How did she get here? It's a tale worthy of the greatest orators. So, today, we're going to ancient Rome at the watershed moment when everything hangs in the balance. Will Rome remain a republic, or will it abandon everything it stood for the past 500 years and become an empire? Right in the eye of the whole political storm is Fulvia, a Roman patrician who shaped some of the most famous episodes in Roman history.
Wow.
And we're going to ponder the veracity of the Latin proverb, acta non verba. Deeds, not words. Fulvia was a doer, not a ditherer. Carl Jung famously said, you are what you do, not what you say you'll do. And I think Fulvia would wholeheartedly agree. She would say, don't talk and talk and talk, do. Of course, Fulvia had an arch nemesis, the famous orator Cicero. He loved words. He lived for words. And anybody who wasn't good at words, he despised. For many reasons, he had only terrible things to say about Fulvia. As I might add, he did about most women.
Almost everyone he knew, it seems like.
Yeah. And it's mostly his words that survive to tell us the story of Fulvia.
Sure.
And also those amazing bullets. Was Fulvia a stupid, ignorant, jealous woman who was personally responsible for the destruction of 500 years of the Roman Republic?
Probably not.
Or was she a woman of deeds while the men around her were dithering? Let's find out. I'm Katie Nelson.
And I'm Olivia Mickle.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
I'm Dr. Daisy Dunn, and I'm an author and a classicist. My most recent book is The Missing Thread, A Women's History of the Ancient World, and I'm also the author of The Shadow of Vesuvius, A Life of Pliny, and Catullus' Bedspread, The Life of Rome's Most Erotic Poet.
I loved Daisy Dunn's new book, The Missing Thread, and I loved speaking to her about it. Not just to dive into the life of Fulvia, but both of us as historians have had that wonderful experience of discovering that when you go looking for women in the archives, even when you're pretty sure there's nothing there, you find stuff.
Yeah, so I'm really familiar with the fact that when you're reading classical material, you are dealing predominantly with male voices. You're dealing with male writers, male historians talking about the great deeds of men. And setting out to write a book about women, I realised that I'm going to have to use the same material, which seems to me so male-dominated, but I'm actually going to have to actively seek out the women within those books, because what else can I do? We know that women were writing in the ancient world. There were poets, there were women who were writing history, but so little of their work survives that you have to be really dependent upon these male-derived sources. So I was actually really surprised when I went back and was looking through sources, which I'd read some of these sources hundreds of times. You know, the histories of Herodotus, the father of history, writing in the 5th century BC. I thought I knew his work inside out, but actually there are so many really interesting women embedded within the narrative. They're there, but I'd completely overlooked them because I think we're almost taught as students to find the prevailing narrative. You kind of get used to thinking, okay, so this is the story of the Greco-Persian Wars. These are the main events. And when you do that, you end up overlooking these women who are in the shadows. You know, there are women who are playing really, really integral roles to key events that we're used to learning about when we were in college, when we were at school. And yet, you know, a lot of these women were not familiar to me until I started researching this book. And that, in one way, it was quite alarming. I've been reading classics. It's about 15 years of research have gone into this book.
One of those women who's continually in the shadows in so many famous episodes is Fulvia. Let's take her out of the shadows and put her at the center of her own life. And wow, the story of Rome in the age of Caesar, you know, the twilight of the Republic, it just comes to life.
Yeah, so Fulvia is a name who is familiar to a lot of classicists. I'd say she's not a household name yet, and that deserves to change because Fulvia has this astonishing life.
Now, the blessing and the curse is that Cicero had so much to say about Fulvia. Because of him, we know quite a lot about her, but he hates her.
Wow.
Fulvia is born around, I think, probably about 83 BC in Tusculum, in Latium in Italy. And she comes from probably quite an elite family. She had a large dowry that came from a wealthy mother called Sempronia. And she had a father who was called Marcus Fulvius Bambalio. And Cicero tells us a little bit about her father. He says that he was a man of no consequence, which is quite interesting. Because one thing we know about his name is Bambalio meant stammerer. So it meant that he had a stutter. So quite possibly that would have influenced the way that Cicero wrote about him. He, being an orator, everything was on the voice, everything was on your presentation as a person. If he couldn't speak in public very fluently, that was probably enough for Cicero to discount him as a man of no consequence.
Because he has a stammer, he is like, they're not good at words. They don't even matter.
And the only way a woman could have access to any kind of importance at all would be if her father was very, very, very important. So obviously...
The men, yes. And it's certainly possible that Fulvia may have had a stammer as well. At least there's one interesting clue.
I think it's slightly possible, maybe, that she had a similar speech impediment or something, because one of the things, really unusual descriptions we have of her, is that one of her cheeks was significantly larger than the other cheek. But because she was a woman, this was seen to be, at least to the man who described it, a very attractive feature. And he's a Sicilian orator, and he said that she tempted the point of my pen, which I think is a kind of euphemism. So that's quite interesting, but we don't have any physical representations that show her full frontal to be able to make that judgment as to, what did this actually look like in reality. What we have instead is we have some representations on coins, which historians are still arguing over. Because they're on coins, they are in profile, so you only kind of see one cheek rather than both. So very, very big eyes. She has a slim nose. She has her hair done up in the kind of bun that was really fashionable in Rome in that period. What's interesting about these coins is that if they do show Fulvia, and it seems entirely possible, they are some of the earliest representations of coins to feature a woman, which attests to her prominence.
The first thing we can know about her for sure is that she married an important guy, and as is the case with women in the ancient past, only thus emerges from historical anonymity.
A lot of women who were marrying in her time would have been about 14 or 15. She seems to have been more like 18 or 19. She was married to Publius Clodius Pulcher, who was already a very notorious populist politician in Rome. This demagogue.
Clodius is really shaking things up.
He's already known as to be quite a bad boy in Rome. Around the time that he is betrothed to Fulvia, he is actually dragged into court, accused of infiltrating a women's only religious festival that was being held at the house of Julius Caesar and Julius Caesar's wife. And he did so by dressing up as a woman, wearing women's clothes, wearing women's slippers. He spoke, people recognised that he was, after all, a man, and he was ejected. And this was seen to be, it sounds hilarious, it seems farcical, it seems almost like a play. But in ancient Rome, this was seen to be really, really serious because it was a religious occasion and there were Vestal virgins present. He was taken to court because he had posed a threat to the chastity of the Vestal virgins. And if Vestal virgins in Rome broke their vows of chastity, it was seen to augur terrible things for the future of Rome. And Clodius seems to have sort of made a mockery of this by infiltrating the household in which these virgins were with other women. So he was dragged before the courts. Cicero was there speaking against him, but he got off scot-free. He got away with it and was able to marry Fulvia. And I think the public impression of him was very, very divided. So I think when they got married, there would have been a lot of intrigue as to what kind of character Fulvia was. And they're said to be inseparable. They quickly produce 2 children, a boy and a girl. And she seems to be very centrally involved in Clodius's political life. And he actually reinstated these things called collegia, which are kind of guilds or unions, which had basically led to a rise of violence in Rome. There are a lot of kind of gangs, political gangs, coming against each other. And there's some speculation that Fulvia played a role in actually organising these collegia, these kind of political gangs, which I think is entirely plausible.
Clodius, he's returning these guilds to power, and they form like rival gangs. He's a man of the people. And even though he's from an elite background, he gets himself adopted by a 20-year-old plebeian who's like a lower class guy as this grand gesture so that he could represent the plebeians in the Senate as tribune of the plebs. A rich guy going, no, I'm the man of the
I'm
people.
your hero.
I'm here for you. Yeah. Julius Caesar presided over the adoption ceremony. So Clodius pushes through legislation to make bread free. Nobody should starve in Rome, he says. Cicero hates him for this. He says, all of this is in defiance of the Republic. This guy is dangerously near a tyrant. And Clodius says, oh yeah? Remind me, who was it that executed a group of rebels a couple years ago without a trial? Who did that, Cicero? Oh, right. It was you, Cicero. And Cicero's like, I had to save Rome. So he puts Cicero on trial, and he's found guilty and exiled from Rome.
Wow.
They've just made a very powerful enemy.
But we don't really see what Fulvia is capable of, actually, until the very end of Clodius's life.
Julius Caesar is sent off to command the conquest of Gaul, which everybody knows is a suicide mission. But Clodius, he's this loyal supporter of Julius Caesar. He's going to keep the faith. And while Caesar is off on this impossible mission to conquer Gaul, he's going to keep the movement going in Rome.
Because of this political reputation he had, because of these very, very daring things that he was doing, he managed to accrue a lot of enemies. And it was when he came into contact with one of these enemies at a crossroads that he actually met this very horrible, sticky end. These two entourages were approaching each other at these crossroads outside of Rome. And one of his political enemies was in the other party. His name was Milo. There were gladiators within these entourages. There were quite sort of motley crews of people. And there was a fight between the two sides. And Clodius got hurt during the crossfire, and it was decided that he should be finished off because he'd be more dangerous as someone who recovered from such a grave injury than he would be dead. So he was left for dead, and his body was found and carried back into Rome. And this is where Fulvia really came into her own. You can imagine the absolute shock. You know, this, your husband of 10 years, the father of your 2 children, has been killed by a political rival, and here is his dead body. And in ancient Rome, women had a real responsibility to care for the dead. They were expected to tend the body, to kind of close the doors of the house, and apply a due ceremony to this process before the public funeral. But Fulvia decided to do something quite different from this. She wanted everybody to see exactly how her husband had died. So she flung open the doors to their villa, and she encouraged people to come in and look at the bloodied, wounded corpse of her husband in order essentially to stir up anger against Milo and his crew. And she even allowed a group of men to carry away the body of Clodius into the forum to set fire to it in a rather hasty cremation. This fire got so out of hand that it actually spread to the Senate House building and several other of the edifices. And there was a real feeling of revolution in the air. And Fulvia was behind all of this. It's really astonishing. There was real anxiety among the politicians in Rome as to what could happen next. Milo, his alleged killer, was then put on trial the following spring.
Milo needs somebody to speak in his defense, and who should appear but Cicero, who has maximized the chaos in Rome to his great advantage, and he's back.
And Cicero decided to defend him as a kind of final act of enmity against Clodius and against Fulvia as well, I would say.
There's no women allowed in the courtroom, of course. They can't vote or be jurors or, anything like that. But they can give evidence.
And it's said that she and her mother stepped forward wearing their mourning clothes, and they gave further evidence. And they said that with their weeping, they greatly moved everyone who stood there gathered. So they played their part in trying to drive up this sense of anger and outrage against Milo. And it was very, very difficult for Cicero to order his case and try and get everything together.
Cicero could not convince them. Milo was driven into exile.
So it was a victory of sorts for Fulvia. I think she was a very confident woman. I think she was fearless. She seems to have been very, very comfortable in the public eye, which is quite unusual. But I should say that women living in Rome in this time, this was not the norm. I mean, most of them were limited largely to the company of other women. They stayed indoors most of the time. Their principal occupation was weaving clothes. That have had a fairly limited education in most cases. And their purpose in life was to be homemakers, to raise children, to take care of the provisions in the household. So it was quite unusual for women to be having any kind of public voice whatsoever. And, she's still a very young woman at this point. She'd have been in her late 20s, and this is really only the beginning of her. So she finds another husband. The pressure was on in Rome this period. If you are a woman and you are still of childbearing age, the expectation upon you is that you should remarry as soon as was seen as proper. And that period is 10 months. This time elapses. She finds a second husband, who is a man called Gaius Scribonius Curio. And he's quite an interesting character. He is probably best known in the history of Rome for overseeing the creation of this very special kind of theatre. Romans crazy about theatre. He had this theatre created, which was essentially two theatres. And when I say theatre in the ancient world, we're talking about a D-shaped theatre. There's an amphitheatre is around, or kind of over one. The theatre we see plays is D-shaped. So he had two of these D-shaped theatres made, and they're connected on a pivot. And this pivot could be turned so that you could make these two half theatres essentially into one amphitheatre, or separate it out again, and they could be essentially back to back, and you have two separate performances. So this is hugely exciting for the people of Rome. This is like a brand new. Leonardo da Vinci looked into trying to replicate the engineering behind this, and even he struggled to see how the Romans would have done it, and yet this man managed to do it, and this is his great achievement.
Now her life is taking quite a pivot from bloody, brutal politics to the theater. Celebrity engineering, the world of arts and invention, humanities.
Cool.
And she seems to really jive with this world. She's well-read, she's intellectual, she dives in.
But this poor man, he was sent off to fight in Numidia in Africa, and he lost his life there. So they weren't married for very long, and Fulvia's widowed again.
Almost immediately, a widow again. And apparently the most eligible bachelorette, because there's this guy by the name of Mark Antony.
Hey.
Mark Antony comes bearing the news that not only did Julius Caesar not die in his attempt to conquer Gaul, but he actually conquered Gaul, and Mark Antony had become Julius Caesar's right-hand man.
Mark Antony is a man who is very much on the make. at this point. He has excelled as a military general. He's not a cultured man. He is much more of a kind of strategist. He's a good soldier. Mark Antony, I think we can have no doubt over this. There are so many sources. They all say that he was a great womanizer. Same way with Julius Caesar. Same way with actually most of these men in power.
Immediately, Mark Antony wants to marry Fulvia.
And there's an immediate impediment to their getting together. And we have to rely largely on the account of Cicero for this. And we have to take this, given what Cicero we know about already about Cicero, we have to take this slightly carefully, this evidence. But what we're told is that Mark Antony was having a relationship with an actress whose name was Cleopatra. And Fulvia didn't want to get involved with him because of that. So Fulvia supposedly says to Mark Antony, well, I will have nothing to do with you for as long as you are still seeing this actress. I do not want to be the other woman while you're seeing her. And supposedly, Mark Antony dresses up as a messenger. He puts a hood over his head and he writes a letter to Fulvia to swear to her that he will never have anything more to do with Cleopatra, who will just want to see her and her only. And he delivers this letter to her by night himself in disguise. And supposedly Fulvia opens this letter and she reads it and she weeps. And she's not usually shown to be a very emotional character. She's usually seen to be quite brusque, quite in control of her emotions. But supposedly at that point, he revealed himself as he really was. And they agreed to get married. And they were married about 47 BC.
Ancient Roman Hallmark movie.
Yeah, like weird Hallmark movie. But it says a lot about how they perceive romance back then.
It's what Henry VIII tried to do, only it worked out. Right, when Henry VIII dresses as a servant or something and goes and I mean, maybe that's why Henry VIII thought this was going to work out.
Totally.
Except it did not.
He's trying to pull a Mark Antony.
And again, this is like the beginning of a whole new chapter to Fulvia's life. Mark Antony is really on the rise, and his political life and his personal life are going to drag Fulvia once more very much into the limelight.
She's married to Mark Antony, and it certainly is not yet clear how this is going to pan out. Will Julius Caesar be victorious? What will happen to the Senate? Caesar and Mark Antony, they did a pretty genius thing. Not only, of course, did they return victorious from Gaul, which surprised everybody, but they divvied up Gaul among their soldiers and gifted them this prime real estate in Gaul. So now they have this very loyal army at their beck and call. The Senate is like, you can't do that. And Cicero, of course, is making sure everyone knows how high the stakes are, how dangerous these guys are. He's like, the Republic hangs in the balance.
And there is a moment where it looks very likely that Mark Antony might be outlawed because of his politicking. And because he's essentially breaking the law, the way that he was behaving politically, particularly in relation to his troops in Gaul. And the Senate decide that they will outlaw him.
That's it. That's the end of Mark Antony. Or it would be if he weren't married to Fulvia.
Fulvia she stays up all night and she essentially campaigns on his behalf. She knocks on the doors of other influential men around the city of Rome in order to have this decision reversed. So she is really very politically active. I mean, this kind of goes against the grain of everything else we read about, Roman women being at home and not allowed to sort of circulate with men. Here we have a woman who actually is clearly on familiar terms with other senators, with other political men of influence. And, it was incredibly bold of her, really. And Mark Antony,
he's saved by his wife in the face of all that opposition from Cicero. Here's Fulvia, the woman of action. She will not dither. She won't wait for her fate to be decided. She will march from door to door if she has to. She will push the arc of history in her direction. And Cicero goes, okay, he can stay, but he has to give up Gaul.
And Mark Antony, in the event, he actually refused to relinquish Gaul. So he managed to antagonize Cicero further against him and against Fulvia.
Obviously, this is a precarious situation. What you need is an ally, Mark Antony. You need to do what Caesar did. You need to form a triumvirate. Now, this guy named Octavian, who's the other major power player, he also has a lot of connections to Julius Caesar. She's like, we need an alliance. We need it to be powerful, unbreakable, and we need it now.
So Fulvia decides to play a quite an important part in this coming together of this political alliance, because she's got her teenage daughter by her first husband, Clodius. And she says that her daughter, Claudia, can marry Octavian in order to essentially seal the deal of this political alliance between the two men. So as a result of that, she's the wife of Mark Antony. She's the mother of Octavian's bride. She's essentially within this political circle, within this alliance in her own right. And Cicero is getting more and more perturbed by this. Cicero is a great defender of the Roman Republic. He hates the idea of these slightly dodgy political alliances being forged. It worries him that people like Octavian, people like Mark Antony are intent on breaking all the rules. So he decides to make a series of speeches against Mark Antony and Fulvia. And these speeches are known as the Philippics. And they are absolutely outrageous. If you read them, it will just make you, I think, very, very angry. I mean, Cicero is clearly a brilliant orator, but at the same time, he could be completely ruthless. And you read these speeches, in particular for interest for what they say about Fulvia, because they say that she is ruthless. They say that she is bloodthirsty. She's very, very tough. He says that she's quite happy to stand by and be splattered by the blood of the enemies who Mark Antony is slaying. She doesn't care that she's got men's blood all over her. He's basically insinuating that she's a natural born killer in her own right. She's also sort of driven by money enormously, he said. She is immoral. And he said that she is too powerful. He said that she has been entrusted with so much power by Mark Antony that she was actually auctioning off provinces of the Roman Empire. I think we have to take all of this with a massive pinch of salt. But the even more extraordinary thing that happens next.
The Ides of March, 44 BC. Mark Antony was Julius Caesar's right-hand man, his bodyguard. But on that fateful day, Mark Antony was barred from entering the Senate building. Caesar went inside and was stabbed 23 times. Mark Antony, he immediately started a campaign to apprehend all the assassins and to bring them to justice. Cicero, on the other hand, who wasn't there that day, advocated for amnesty for all the assassins. And of course, Antony's like, that's not right. That's a threat to the Republic. What about the rule of law? So this is Rome at the sunset of the Republic. A life in politics has become a life of kill or be killed. And Fulvia knows this. Mark Antony and Octavian are pushing through new laws to hunt down Julius Caesar's conspirators and to kill them.
Conspirators or assassins?
Both. Oh. Yes, the assassins, but also anybody who seems like they were in cahoots, namely Cicero, who conveniently wasn't there that day, but also advocated for amnesty. So he knows they're coming for him, and he goes on the run.
Cicero submits quite courageously to the blows. He had his head chopped off. He had the hand chopped off with which he'd written these offensive speeches. And these body parts are taken back to Rome and they are displayed within the Roman Forum. And it's said that Fulvia picked them up and she got the head and she took a hairpin from her hair and she stuck it in Cicero's tongue. She was so angry by everything that he'd said about her in public, that she was finally getting her own back. She was piercing that tongue that had spoken so horribly about her during her life.
Especially as a woman who over her lifetime has been associated with stammering and has been mocked for it.
Mm-hmm.
Now she is getting back at Cicero for his words.
Yeah. Good.
We can't know if it's true, but it's so weirdly specific. I'm inclined to believe it.
Yeah.
Like, if it was a myth or a legend, I would think it would be more biblical. You know, it would be like a head delivered on a platter or something like that.
We probably only know a fraction of what she was actually doing, but she was clearly very much in the limelight. But it all kind of, it gets even messier and even more extraordinary, I think, on Fulvia's behalf in terms of what happens next in the story, because it unravels even more.
Things are starting to fall apart between Mark Antony and Octavian. What do you know? They made it to the top, and instead of sharing power like they said they would, they turned on each other.
Yeah.
Mark Antony goes off to Egypt to secure a military alliance, where he meets one Cleopatra and loses all control. He stays and stays and stays. Meanwhile, Octavian has this whole army of soldiers that he needs to pay. And the soldiers are like, hey, look what Julius Caesar and Mark Antony did in Gaul. Give us land, give us property. So Octavian's starting to kick families off of their land and giving their farms and their villas to his soldiers. The difference is he's doing it in Italy, not far away in Gaul, And so all of the victims are gathering in Rome and raging about it. And Fulvia is there witnessing all of it. And she's writing Mark Antony over and over, like, get over here. The stakes are so high right now. People are turning on Octavian. Mark Antony's like, sounds serious. I'll think about it. Lots to think about. I'll look into my alliances, Dithering. Mark Antony's brother is even elected tribune of the plebs, which is a massively powerful position. It's actually the same position that Clodius, husband number 1, had. But still, Mark Antony dithers. He's not coming back.
Wow.
And Fulvia's like, acta non verba, deeds, not words. We can get this taken care of. And then the trigger. Octavian sent his wife, Fulvia's daughter, back to Fulvia and said, I don't want to be married to her anymore. Never consummated, no problem. We're just going to undo this. Bye. Formally breaking the alliance.
This is really the last straw for Fulvia.
Thus, we return to Perugia, to a war that Fulvia has incited. She's funded. She gave the speeches. She's leading the thing. She's like, I'm sick of waiting for Mark Antony. We can resolve this here and now. Somebody needs to act. Which is why Daisy Dunn says it should be called Fulvia's War. It's called the Perugian War, which is lame. It's Fulvia's War.
This terrible war, which is essentially a sort of a siege war that happens at Perugia in Italy. And we have Mark Antony's brother and Fulvia and their forces on one side, and Octavian's forces on the other. Mark Antony, by this point, is in Alexandria with a certain Cleopatra.
And in that moment, I can see her so confident. This is the solution, This victory is going to solve everything. Everybody hates Octavian right now. Antony will return back home, and he'll stay because he'll be emperor. He won't need the Egyptian alliance anymore. Nip this in the bud.
And there's a very bitter fighting between the two sides, and missiles are basically being flung over the walls of this city of Perugia. And this is where we get this really concrete evidence for the prominence of Fulvia, which is so rare to find. We have all these written sources describing her participation in these events, but we can't verify it until we get these pieces of evidence. And these are the missiles themselves. And when I say missiles, I mean these lead slingshot bullets, which were released and sent over the city walls. And these missiles were engraved with messages. So we find messages for Octavian. We're saying, there's lots of them saying things like, "Open your asshole, Octavian. There's a missile coming your way," something to that effect. And then we find some of these which are actually written and aimed at Fulvia herself. So one of them says, "I'm aiming for Fulvia's clitoris." And this is extraordinary. I mean, that word wasn't even used very often in the ancient world. In Latin, it's landica. And it's not a word you come across very much because, I mean, in antiquity, the clitoris is not seen as an attractive part of a woman at all. It was seen to be a sort of malformed penis. You know, it wasn't something that's generally praised by men in literature. It was seen to be something that was slightly foul. So I think in the context of this inscription, to aim for her clitoris, it's meant to be like a disgusting image, right, that comes from this. And it's just incredible this is found at the site of the siege, because it verifies all these things we're reading about her playing a leading role within this war. And this is why I want to call this Fulvia's War. Perusine War is kind of slightly forgettable. Fulvia's War is much more memorable. And it just shows us how well known Fulvia is. She's not some woman who's there like playing a role in the background. People know her name enough and they're blaming her for this war. And I think this is the really sorry thing because she is on the losing side of this war. The forces of Octavian are stronger. This war does not go her way. She's spared, his brother is spared as well, but many of the men who'd fought for them are actually put to death, and that includes up to 300 senators and equestrians who are the kind of knights, you know, just below the senators in the social hierarchy. And so this is really shocking as a turn of events. And Mark Antony hears about it, and he doesn't hurry to return home at all, you know, to try and sort this situation out. Cleopatra's actually become pregnant with his twins at this time. She's going to give birth to a boy and a girl. They'll have another child a bit later on. It's very, very difficult to imagine what's going through her head, but she definitely wants to see him because they actually have 2 boys together. And these boys have barely actually known their own father. They're still young. They're probably about 3 and 7 years old at this point, and they wouldn't have spent much time with their father at all. She writes him a letter and they agree that they will meet in Athens to have a sort of a short reunion. And it seems likely that Mark Antony also blames her for causing like a huge mess in his absence. He's not at all grateful for her doing this, you know, essentially on his behalf. He's just infuriated.
Blamed for everything.
So she's become really notorious.
And then Mark Antony gets a message from Octavian. We need to talk. So he rushes off to Italy, which is where she was trying to get him to go for years. And she's like, if I'd known you would run off to Italy, I wouldn't have come all the way to Greece to meet you.
Fulvia becomes unwell suddenly. We're not told any details of what's wrong with her. But Antony doesn't hesitate to leave Fulvia where she is. And at that point, it's in a city just near Corinth in Greece. So he decides to turn back to Italy. And he is heading off to Brundisium, which is modern Brindisi, in the heel of Italy. And he's going to have a conference with Octavian. So maybe this is a kind of an opportunity to sort of repair their relationship in the wake of Fulvia's war. And this kind of negotiations between these 2 sides at this meeting in Brundisium have begun. And then news arrives that Fulvia has actually died while Mark Antony is here in Italy. And you just think to yourself, Oh my goodness. I mean, she's made this trip. Maybe, what if she caught something on that long journey over to Greece? She could have saved herself the journey. We're not told exactly what her illness was. We don't know what was wrong with her. All we really get instead is the reaction of people to her death, which is not what you want to read, really.
All the men essentially say, ding dong, the witch is dead. And they blame everything on Fulvia, the whole mess.
What a relief. What a relief that this current affairs obsessed woman is now dead, because she was such an impediment to the relationship between Mark Antony and Octavian and his other political cronies. She was the one that stopped them from getting on well. And, you know, with her gone, surely now the relationship between these men is going to be stronger. It's going to be a brighter future. They blamed her for stirring up this war. They said she did so out of jealousy for Cleopatra. That, you know, all these men had shed their blood just in order to kind of satisfy this whim on Fulvia's part. And you know, one man said that it seemed extremely profitable for both parties that they were freed of her. Only time would tell as to how wrong these men were. The relationship between Mark Antony and Octavian fell apart very, very rapidly. You know, the civil war was essentially on the horizon, and it really had nothing to do with Fulvia. The relationships between the two were always going to be problematic. You have two men who are essentially vying for absolute power over Rome. Fulvia's not really to blame at all. So it's actually, I think, very, very tragic. You have a woman there who's done astonishing things, and yet all that can be written about her is that she was a destructive force who ruined the future of Rome.
Octavian would, of course, go on to become the first emperor of Rome, and to commemorate the hugeness of the moment, he changed his name to Caesar Augustus. The Caesar Augustus of the Bible, who would declare all the world should be taxed. It's the beginning of a whole new chapter of Roman history. An empire instead of a republic. He establishes the Pax Romana. He gets a new wife, Livia, who's very obedient, who stays home and weaves clothes as a wife should. And when his daughter and granddaughter rebel, he banishes them to desert islands. He crucifies troublesome Jews in Judea, which in hindsight turns out to be a really big deal. All of which is to say, what if Fulvia had defeated him in Fulvia's war?
I think it's the way that she was. I think there's a discrepancy between the way that she was written about and the way that she was. You know, I still feel this when I read those kind of the opposite of tributes, really, by the men who wrote about her after she died, about her being sort of interfering, about her being meddling, about her being, you know, all these very negative things. That just seems so reminiscent of the way that so many women are still written about in the press today. I think particularly when they have some connection to politics, or any kind of like being in the limelight in any way, women are really, really subject to other people's opinions. They don't have an opportunity to kind of negate what's being said about them. It really made me think, seeing the reality behind those stories. She's a woman who I think was really striving for her husband's behalf. It's not like she wanted to rule. I mean, one of the historians, Plutarch, said that she was hungry to rule herself. I mean, clearly that's not the case. There's no women who were ruling in Rome at that period. It's clearly for her husband that she's doing it. She's not hungry for power herself. It's not her own ego that's driving her to behave in this way. It's, I think, duty, a sense of duty to her husband, which was a quality that Romans conversely really admired. You know, husbands expected their wives to be dutiful. She was essentially being dutiful to the extreme. And yet she was criticized for doing that. So I think that's just something that seems just so timeless. You know, your motivations, your desires, your plans for doing something, the way that they can be misconstrued by other people who are determined to drive their own narrative. And, you know, that contortion of the reality, that's what really strikes me as being a timeless thing. We can't be certain. We're dealing with stuff that is a lot of the time over 2,000 years old. And you can have people who write sort of more modern history books and say, oh, isn't that really, really frustrating to be dealing with so many maybes or we don't knows or whatever. And it's difficult to create a fluid narrative. But I think you have to almost be astonished that we have anything. You know, the fact that we can pick out personalities and we can actually come face to face with people like Fulvia and have a picture of who they were from so long ago across such a different cultural divide. I think that in itself has to be celebrated.
Special thanks to Daisy Dunn, whose book is The Missing Thread, A Women's History of the Ancient World, and you can find it at any good bookshop and on our website, What'sHerName.podcast.com. Music for this episode was generously shared by M. Murray, Michael Levy, Jesse Gallagher, Jimena Contreras, I Think I Can Help You, and Daniel Foster Smith. Our intern is Katie Boucher. Also on our website, you can find information about our upcoming tours, including a brand new tour to Italy, Rome, Perugia, and Florence. Check it out, What'sHerNamePodcast.com. Thank you so much for donating, and thank you for listening.